brought to us, of course, by God through the Apostle Paul. And the lesson was first for them, but also for us. And it is a warning. It is a warning for them and for us. And the warning is this. Chapter 4, verse 14. I do not write these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. If we were to read through, and we will, we're going to find that the warning says, your state, where you are now, is not of God. So let's begin by looking at verse 8 of chapter 4. Read with me if you're there. You are already filled. You have already become rich. You have become kings without us. And I would indeed that you had become kings, so that we also might reign with you. Now you might be asking yourself already, what are they filled with? What is this abundance, this richness that they have? Well, you're going to have to wait in order to find that answer. It almost may seem as though it's a compliment to them. But I encourage you to hold off on that judgment. Let us look at what the apostles are. Next verse. Verse 9. For I think God has exhibited us apostles last of all as men condemned to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. The NIV says, for it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena. What the text is getting at here is that the apostles, these who are of God, these apostles of God, are essentially put out and exhibited for the world to see. God made it for the world to see the apostles and in a way put them on a stage so that the whole universe, it says in verse 9 in the NIV, we have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as men. So everybody are to watch these apostles who God put forth to show for you to look at. They are ones who are condemned to death, and they are last of all. That's who these apostles are. So you have, on one hand, they are kings. They are filled. They are rich. But we, the apostles, look at us. We are spectacles for the world and angels, condemned to death. I encourage you to start to draw this comparison in your mind. It will help. Let's continue reading on. Verse 10. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are prudent in Christ, in other words, wise. We are weak, you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are without honor. It says, to the present hour we are both hungry and thirsty. We are poorly clothed and are roughly treated and are homeless, and we toil, working with our own hands. When we are reviled, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to consolate. When we have become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even unto now. You see all the things that the apostles are and the things that the Corinthians are. They're different. They're very different. But then the question is, where's the warning? Because that's what was in verse 14. He says, this I admonish you in, not to shame you, but I admonish you. Admonishment is a warning. So where's the warning? Please advance the slide. Let's turn back, reflecting on what has already been said in chapter 1, verse 26. And we'll see why this is a warning. Chapter 1, verse 26 and following. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world. Hold on. Keep your finger there. Let's go back to 4 for a second. Chapter 4, verse 10 says, we are foolish for Christ's sake, and God has chosen the foolish things to shame the wise. Oh, what are the Corinthians? It says in chapter 4, verse 10, it says they are prudent, or the NIV says, we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. Consider the context. Let's go back. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong. It says, we are weak, but you are strong. Okay. Let's go back. And the base things of the world and the despised things of the world God has chosen. Let's go back, chapter 4. It says, you are distinguished, but we are without honor. To the present hour, we are both hungry and thirsty. That doesn't sound like they're filled. We are poorly clothed. That doesn't sound like they're rich. We are roughly treated and homeless. And the base things of the world, chapter 1, and the despised things God has chosen, the things that are not, that he may nullify the things that are, that no man should boast before God. So, the apostles are the things that God has chosen You see? He has put these people on display for all the world to see, men and angels. And through the apostle, he's saying, look at you guys. You guys are wise. You guys are strong. You guys are distinguished. But look at us. Now, you also may be thinking, okay, in verse 14, it says, I do not write these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. Well, why then does he say, I don't write these things to shame you, but when you go back to that verse, chapter 1, verse 27, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Where's the understanding in this? Paul is not writing to shame, but God says, I have chosen these things to shame you. It's God doing this. And that's why it's a warning. I'm warning you, look at yourself. Paul is admonishing them. Paul is warning them. Now let us keep reading. He says, I do not write these things to shame you. This is chapter 4, verse 14. I do not write these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For if you were to have countless tutors in Christ, yet you would not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I became your father through the gospel. Notice he calls them his beloved children, and he is their father. And then he says, I exhort you, therefore, as my children, and I your father, be imitators of me. Wow. That's what he's talking about. Bring all that context into that statement. God put him on display for the world and angels to see. This is the type of people that God has chosen: the weak, the despised, etc. And he says, I am your father through the gospel, and you are my children. Imitate me. Wow. These are the types of people that God chose. Please advance the slide. Imitation. Father like son. Verse 17. For this reason I have sent to you Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child in the Lord. So here's another one of his children, beloved and faithful. And he will remind you of my ways, which are in Christ, just as I teach everywhere in every church. So you see, the warning is that you got to look at yourself. And are your ways the ways that God has chosen? Because God has put us as apostles on display for everybody to see. And we are of the way that God has chosen. Now, because we are of the way that God has chosen, imitate me. And I'm even going to send one of my children in the faith to imitate me. Now, I want to put this before you, and God willing, we'll discuss it more in class. But when it says that we are to imitate him, there's only a few ways that I can see this being accomplished. Before you run off and think you gotta get rid of your home and be homeless. Either Paul is going to have to tell you his ways so that you can know what those are. We're going to have to wait for Timothy to come remind us of those ways. Or, without knowing it, Paul is going to reveal those ways through these writings. We can jump into why those options are the case later and look at those things, but those are the conclusions that I've come to with regard to that exhortation. Nevertheless, the warning still stands, brethren, that we must make sure that we are choosing the things that are of God, as opposed to just being filled. And I encourage you now to think about that filled. Because what were the Corinthians? 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And I, brethren, could not speak to you as spiritual men, but as to men of the flesh, as to babes in Christ. I gave you milk to drink and not solid food, for you are not able to receive it. Indeed, even now you are not able, for you are still fleshly. They are filled with this fleshly mentality, this natural man mentality, this wisdom of the world. That's what they're filled with. If they're doing nothing but filling their life with these things, they're not chosen of God. It's still a warning that we can all heed, because we have to look to see if our life is being built up as the temple of God on the things that God has chosen, the weak things, the despised things, and not things of the world. Shall we pursue being rich? Shall we pursue being filled in this life? We have an example through the apostles of them acting out the things that God has chosen. So let us heed the warning. Let us hear the word and be doers of the word. And let us be sure that our ways are chosen by God.